ballot rigging, intimidation and forgery in the Postal Workers Union. He discovered that having a postal ballot for a postal union election was a bit like putting a fox in charge of the chook house.
Nobody minds losing a fair ballot, but it's when you get cheated out of something, that's the part that hurts.
And the ballot was just the beginning. Quentin Cook claims there were other more sinister and far-reaching implications.
You have the right wing of the ALP running the government, and you have the right wing of the ALP running the union. Your master and your servant is the same person.
Election is either bravery or plain stupidity, but it's what Quentin Cook did back in 1994. If stirring the pot was this postman's aim, he certainly achieved it. What he uncovered was ballot rigging, standover tactics, official incompetence and government indifference. And he managed to get the election overturned. But 2 years later, still no one's been charged. And it's only Quentin Cook who's suffered. He's been sacked. With nothing done for so long, tonight 60 Minutes conducts its own investigation.
It's a very, very, very important thing that our elections in a democratic society are full and free and fair. Nobody minds losing a fair ballot, but it's when you get cheated out of something, that's the part that hurts.
Quentin Cook used to get around this neighbourhood on a motorbike with a bag of mail. That was before Australia Post sacked him last year. When he was a postie, Quentin was also an active unionist. In the union election 2 years ago, he stood as a candidate endorsed by the Liberal Party. Yes, the Liberal Party. So you thought you'd stand as a Liberal candidate in a union dominated by the right wing of the ALP?
Well, one voice, I suppose the power of one voice can speak out. And this voice would have against the excesses and the outrages being perpetrated by the incumbents at the time.
It was the votes of workers like these that Quentin Cook wanted. There are 18,000 Australia Post employees in New South Wales, many of them in mail exchanges like this one. Some of them were migrant women from Vietnam and the Philippines. And when it came to getting their vote, some unorthodox methods were employed.
Mail centres are things that operate 24 hours a day under 3 different shifts. Now, what was happening in this system, where the distribution of a preferable shift is determined by a person called a shift changer, who was given the responsibility of allocating shifts to different individuals. Now, what was happening, some unscrupulous shift changers would take the opportunity to allocate a desirable shift to an individual on the basis of whether he handed over his blank ballot paper or not.
And if you refused, you found yourself on the midnight shift?
You found yourself working in a very unsatisfactory shift, you did.
It wasn't just standover tactics in the mail exchanges that made Quentin Cook think something was going badly wrong with the election. He discovered that having a postal ballot for a postal union election was a bit like putting a fox in charge of the chook house. There were reports of ballot papers being stolen from sorting bins, reports of ballot papers returned address unknown, falling into the wrong hands. And it was around about then that the watchdogs were called in.
The Federal Police got involved and I believe commenced an investigation around about the July of 1994 and finished the investigation in September, closed the case citing no evidence, couldn't find anything.
Soon after, though, Mr Justice Moore of the Industrial Relations Court began a separate inquiry into the union election and immediately heard evidence pointing to a major scandal.
Well, I concluded after a detailed examination of all the ballots that there was indeed widespread fraud in this ballot.
Paul Westwood is a handwriting expert who gave evidence in Justice Moore's inquiry. He's a forensic document examiner. To him, a person's handwriting is like their fingerprint. And after looking at all the ballot papers in the Postal Workers Union election, he discovered that many had been filled out by the one person.
And we found that there were significant similarities in the numerals 1 through to 34 on those ballots within any one bundle, which led me to conclude that they were in fact written by the same person.
These are some of the ballot papers that Paul Westwood examined. They're laid out side by side to conceal who this person actually voted for. Even to the untrained eye, it's clear that all of the ballots have been filled out by one person. We're not allowed to show you who this crook voted for, but it's a safe bet it was for himself and his mates. Do you think it would be terribly difficult to find the people responsible?
I'm very confident, take this selection here as an example, that if we were given a suitable amount of material, numerals, written by a suspect, we could confidently say whether they wrote it, or we could say that there's no evidence that they wrote it.
After hearing Paul Westwood's evidence, Justice Moore concluded there'd been proven and widespread fraud in the election. The ballot had certainly been rigged. But the judge found there had been other irregularities in the course of the election.
Mr. Healy, having regard to your experience as a returning officer in industrial elections and other elections...
Mr. Terence Healy was the returning officer appointed by the Australian Electoral Commission for the 1994 Postal Workers Union election. It was his job to supervise the collection and counting of the ballot papers. At Justice Moore's inquiry, he was asked about some of his actions.
Mr. Healy, you were asked some questions this morning as to your knowledge that at least 2 persons had deliberately voted twice in this election, to your knowledge.
Yes.
And you did not refer that matter to the federal police?
I didn't, no.
Do you recall recommendations being made to you by the police with respect to the count and scrutiny to be conducted by you?
Yes.
Did you follow those recommendations?
No, we didn't.
At a cost of $88 million a year, it's the job of the workers in this Canberra office of the Australian Electoral Commission to make sure that elections in this country are conducted fairly and without corruption. Clearly, in the case of the 1994 election for the Postal Workers Union, the AEC failed, and failed miserably, to prevent widespread corruption and fraud.
Is it correct that you wrote to the federal police and informed them that the Liberal Party was involved in this election?
I did mention that, yes.
Was there any relevance in you doing that?
Well, they wanted to be kept informed of everything that was going on in the election, so I informed them what was going on. Yes.
Well, you told the court earlier that you did not think it was important to inform the federal police that 2 persons had deliberately voted twice. Is that a less important matter than the issue I have just raised with you?
While Justice Moore's inquiry continued, Quentin Cook worked as a postman and as the union rep at this post office in the foothills of Sydney's Blue Mountains. In his 18 years with Australia Post, Quentin had never been in trouble. Yet suddenly, in September last year, he was dismissed. You were allegedly dismissed for being rude to a supervisor.
That's correct. Well, discourteous was the term. Failure to show proper courtesy to the supervisor.
Well, what on earth did you say?
Well, it took me completely by surprise. But in evidence in the unfair dismissal case, the operations manager of Australia Post said in evidence, on one occasion I heard Mr Cook say to his supervisor, "How did you get the job as supervisor?" And on another occasion I heard Mr Cook say to his supervisor, "What did you do that for?"
Now, you did say those things?
Well, if I did say it, yeah, I'll cop that. Yes.
The special theory of relativity.
Life for the Cooks on a postie's salary was hard enough, but it became a lot tougher when Quentin got the sack.
Satisfactory.
He was fighting not only to have the union election investigated, now he was also fighting Australia Post over his dismissal.
Mr. Mulliner, Australia Post has informed the court in these proceedings that
When
the
Quentin went to
analysis of the
court
process
alleging
was
wrongful
the current
dismissal,
process in
a senior
Australia
officer of
Post
Australia
in
Post was
1995.
cross-examined by his
That's
lawyer.
correct. You do agree that the contemplated procedure in relation to disciplinary matters involving misconduct by employees is firstly informal counselling.
That's correct.
Secondly, formal or warning counselling, one or the other.
That's correct.
You do agree that in this case there was no formal counselling.
That's correct.
You agree also there was no warning counselling.
That's correct.
Australia Post argued that Quentin Cook's discourtesy to his supervisor was so serious that it could deserve dismissal without being given the benefit of counselling. So serious, Australia Post argued, that it was in the same category as serious assault, fraud or major damage to property. It was on that basis that he was dismissed. What does your dismissal say to you about Australia Post management?
About Australia Post management, I believe that both the union, that was the former incumbents, and Australia Post management both wore matching pyjamas.
At the time of the election, this man, Alan Jarman, was the branch secretary of the union. Jarman has now disappeared, believed to be living somewhere in Europe. Jalal Natour was the union's assistant secretary. He died of a brain tumour during Justice Moore's inquiry. Both men were members of the New South Wales Right faction of the Labor Party.
It was no secret that Michael Lee, the Minister for Communications, is a member of that particular faction, and as part of his portfolio as Minister for Communications, he was in charge of Australia Post. So what you've got is this situation where you have the right wing of the ALP running the government, and you have the right wing of the ALP running the union. Your master and your servant is the same person. Now, I feel that there was a great deal of unwillingness for things at a ministerial level to be pursued down that path, because basically what they would be investigating are their own people.
In September last year, the then Minister for Justice, Duncan Kerr, wrote to Peter Reith, then Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations. Asked by Mr Reith why there'd been no action over the ballot rigging, Mr Kerr wrote,
"The Australian Federal Police have advised me that forensic examinations are unlikely to identify specific persons who might have been responsible for manipulating the result of the election."
Well, he got it wrong. I mean, the fact is we now know that there was widespread electoral fraud, and even at the time that that letter was written, the evidence had been presented to the court by a leading forensic expert pointing out in black and white that the thing was a fraud, that blokes sat around a kitchen table and filled in ballot papers. Now, the police closed their file, the evidence became very clear, I wrote to the Minister, and the fact is not enough has happened.
Mr Westwood, take a look at these, if you would, handwriting samples from numerous union officials, and tell me if they match any of the handwriting on the fraudulent ballot papers. An informant gave 60 Minutes samples of the handwriting of a number of candidates in the 1994 election. Some of these candidates were union officials at the time, and in the course of their duties filled out forms which involved writing numerals. It was these numerals that Paul Westwood checked against the fraudulently marked ballot papers.
Well, from the material that you've provided, there are 6 samples here. There is one particular sample that does, I believe, in the light of what I've seen, and allowing for the limited amount of material that I've got on this particular sample, it does warrant closer investigation, I think. It's highlighted that particular writer who wrote on this document is likely to be a very good suspect for having written numerals on one of the larger bundles of ballots.
Larger bundle, how many ballot papers are you talking?
60-odd ballots in that bundle.
Shall we say we've got the murdered body, we've got the bloodied axe, and we've got a number of people with the victim's blood all over them, but so far nobody's thought to ask them, hey, can we question you?
And we